Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. In the midst of a global pandemic where Americans are reporting significant increases in depression and anxiety symptoms, for many, hope has turned into despair. According to the American Psychological Association, America's youngest adults are most likely of all generations to report poor mental health. Every day, 123 individuals die by suicide in the United States alone, 800,000 a year. MarketWatch.com reports anti-anxiety medication prescriptions have spiked 34% during the coronavirus pandemic. Chronicling his own struggle with depression and suicide, our next guest takes an honest look at mental health while offering readers courage and hope in return. His main message: depression doesn't have to be a way of life. In this new work, he addresses the epidemic of depression, anxiety, and suicide, and guides readers out of the deep well of despair and disappointment to breathe renewed hope. He's no stranger to depression, following a debilitating bout of depression after numerous personal tragedies, including the devastating heartbreak, being diagnosed with complex PTSD, and the ultimate losses of his brother and sister. He found a path beyond those struggles and counters the popular belief that you have to settle for learning to live with your depression. Ben Courson is an international speaker, best-selling author, TV and radio personality, and the senior pastor of Applegate Christian Fellowship. He's been featured on Fox, Hallmark Channel, TBN, ABC Family, and other mainstream media outlets. His TV show, Hope Generation with Ben Courson, is broadcast in 180 countries, and his radio show airs on more than 400 stations nationally. Ben travels the globe speaking of God's hope and igniting revival in the hearts of his listeners. You can learn more about Ben at bencourson.com and follow him on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Joining us now to talk about his new book, Flirting with Darkness, Building Hope in the Face of Depression, is Ben Courson. Ben, it's an honor to have you here on
It's an honor to be with you, my friend. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're delighted. You bring a message of hope, and that is the core of the gospel message. It is the challenge that each one of us has in 1 Peter 3:15, is to have a ready answer for the hope that we have. Many people struggle to define that hope, and most often they refer to something that happened 2,000 years ago. Hope is never in the past. It's always future tense. It can't be what was, it must be what is and what is to come. And that is your message, and we appreciate that message tremendously here at Revealing the Truth. Ben, you're a pastor's kid. A lot of expectation, a lot of challenges that came to you, a lot of calling, a lot of limelight, spotlight, believing that your path had been clearly laid out for you. However, along that journey, you found pebbles, rocks, boulders, and walls. Take us back to the early years and talk about that early journey, the excitement, the enthusiasm, and then the heartbreak.
I gave my first sermon actually when I was in third grade. So being a pastor's kid has incredible benefits. My dad's a titan and a giant, and I'm so thankful that I get to call him my father, not only in the faith, but biologically. And because of that, I had a very early shot at preaching. Again, third grade, I gave my first sermon. When I was 16 years old, I began traveling around to speak at other events and churches. When I was 18 years old, I became a pastor at a mega church here in Oregon, and have been here ever since. But I found that I had to project this image to the world, hold up this avatar that wasn't really who I am. And I created a cognitive dissonance where I felt like I had to sort of live up to the expectations that others had of me, that I had to be this super serious, somber, sober, even sorrowful, sad saint. And that wasn't who I am. I love to skateboard. I love to go on fun ventures and friend ventures with God and squad. And so I started to find that if I would have the courageous audacity, as Ken Kesey said, It's just about the rarest thing going when a person has the audacity to be himself. And I started finding, you know what? I am curiously wrought in my mother's womb. All my days are written in his book. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm Salem Elohim. I'm Imago Dei. I'm the image of God. Like, I get to go project not this cognitive dissonance into the world, but I get to be who God created me to be. And when I started being true to my calling and these gifts and callings being without repentance, I found that I had a lot more joy bubbling up in my heart.
You know, this mask that we wear, that the number one issue that counselors deal with pastors is feeling that we are a fraud. And dealing with a fraudulent spirit, that we are to kind of work ourselves up to project an image, when in The Wizard of Oz is a great line. It says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But in God's economy, it's a rare gift when we can tell people, pay attention to the man behind the curtain. Pay attention to the man behind the pastor. Pay attention to the man behind the rabbi. There are real challenges in life. There's real heartbreak. There's real heartache. Pay attention to David, the king. But before he became king, look at what he went through. And after he became king, look at what he wrote. And look at his cry to God in Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you be silent? How long will there be sorrow in my heart? This is the road we were called to travel, but there was not a single promise in any of that we would not know despair, hopelessness, anxiety, depression, heartache, betrayal, death. No promise. And to portray something different than that, that's the fraud.
You're right. You're right. I love how Jesus promised his disciples three things: that they would be incredibly joyful, absurdly fearless, and in constant trouble. Like, those are kind of the three things he seemed to promise us.
Right.
That you'd be incredibly joyful, absurdly fearless, and in constant trouble. And the Bible does, it doesn't wink its eye at suffering. It does often delve into the deeps of despair that we have to weather. In fact, some scholars say that 50% of the Psalms are laments. If you read the book of Lamentations, the word lamentations literally means how. Once a year in Jewish synagogues, they'll read the book of Lamentations and they'll talk about the things that they lost over the last year and they'll grieve it. And I think some people say, oh, the Bible, when you talk about hope and inspiration from the Bible, it's just puppies frolicking on rainbows and unicorns of the sea, narwhals, everything's just fluffy, airy, fairy, happy, clappy, hunky-dory. But in the Bible, you see so much grief. You see so many promises for the afflicted, over 3,500 promises. The great preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, if you were to remove all the promises for the afflicted, all the laments of the sorrowful, all the stories of sadness, you would be left with a very small book. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about doing is removing the stigma and taboo from depression. I think a lot of people in the church can assume, oh, that person must be sinning and that's why they're depressed. But we have to remember that, look at Elijah. After he won a firefight against 850 prophets of Baal in the groves, he was able to, win this great battle of the gods versus the fertility god, the Syrophoenician god Baal, when he was fighting on behalf of and at the behest of Jehovah. He was able to be strong in that moment. But when Jezebel chased him in a chariot, one angry woman sent him running. He outran the chariot. It says that when Jezebel died, she painted her face. I kind of picture her having too much makeup, almost like the It clown female version, just chasing Elijah in a chariot. He outruns her somehow. He ends up in a cave under a juniper broom tree, and he asks God to kill him because he says, there is nobody who hasn't bowed the knee to Baal. Little did he know there were thousands, but he was suicidal. And I love what God did. He made him take a nap after having a good prayer time, and he gave him food. And I think there are sometimes, and this is very simplistic, sometimes there are a few things that a good nap, a good prayer time, and a good meal won't solve when it comes to depression. But it's not just Elijah. You remember Job, the godliest man in the East. Job said, I wish I was a stillborn. He said, I cursed the day I was born. He said, I abhor myself. And he was the godliest man of the East. And his friends were trying to create this theodicy that the reason he was suffering is because he was harboring some evil, that he must have been a fraud. When in reality, the theodicy is of soul making, that God was actually using his tribulation to forge his spirit into steel. Then you look at David. I mean, he was borderline bipolar. One minute he's dancing in his linen ephod before the Ark of the Covenant. The next minute he's saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You look at Jonah after leading the greatest spiritual revival in Assyrian history, so much so that even the animals were repenting in dust and sackcloth and ashes. He was sitting under a gourd, and when a worm ate the plant that was sheltering him from the Nineveh sun, he actually asked God to kill him. And so he was suicidal. And what I kind of want to argue for is that we need to remove the stigma and remove the taboo from those who battle depression in the church.
No greater Jewish prophet than Moses stands before God and says, if you want me to lead these people by myself, then take my life now. This is too much for me to bear.
Wow.
And God answered and said, gather together 70 of your elders, and I will take my spirit which is on you, and I will share it with them. He didn't remove his spirit from him. He actually multiplied.
Yeah.
And brought him 70 to serve. Remember, it was Jesus and the 70 that he sent out 2 by 2.
Yeah, that's good.
God's model is that in our time of despair, he wants to be our strong tower.
You're right.
And we look to a lot of other solutions, but there are instructions. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. It doesn't discount picking up the phone.
Yes.
It doesn't discount making an appointment with a counselor. It doesn't discount getting assessed and maybe being on medication. I had a season in my life where I faced the worst betrayal you can imagine. Went for counseling. Went to my doctor. Said, it's keeping me up all night. I cannot turn it off. I'm talking to God all night long. I just can't. Prescribed medication, said this will help you get through this valley and give you the strength to muster up so you're physically strong enough to endure what lays ahead.
Right.
It is a stigma. And young people are facing today things your father, myself, we didn't face when we were kids. We didn't have technology. We had bullying of a kind, but it was usually the jocks against the long hairs, and we had our own battlegrounds. But it's different today. There are so many social pressures. There are so many things working, and this striving for excellence, this push by parents for having their children win and participate and show off and have the most Facebook followers, the most Instagram likes, and all these metrics. And what happened? What if you're not the one? What if you're not the one that has the likes? It sends you into a questioning period. And maybe depression is the result of a search and either not finding an answer or not liking the answer you're finding because you may not be looking in the right place.
You're right. I think social media is not just of like a subjective opinion of my own. That's why we're depressed. That's actually what sociologists are telling us and researchers are telling us. The reality of qualifying and quantifying everything by likes and engagement and following. In fact, the refresh button on your Instagram feed or Facebook, when you scroll down to refresh your feed, they deliberately designed it so that your hand is doing the same movement as gambling at a slot machine. So it's the same movement as gambling at a slot machine, and it triggers a dopamine loop in your brain where you actually become addicted, because when you gamble, you don't know if you're going to win or you're going to lose when you pull the slot machine. And so that's where the rush is. The same is true with refreshing your feed on like Instagram. You use that same Pavlovian dog subliminal subconscious maneuver. A dopamine loop's triggered in your brain, and you don't know if it's a like or a thumbs down. You don't know if it's a good comment or a bad comment. And so you're literally addicted to social media. And sociologists are telling us this is a big reason why my generation is so depressed. In the year 2017, suicide was the second leading cause of death in my age group. And so one of the things I'm trying to teach my generation is that Jesus is really a master therapist. Like the Bible has incredible solutions here. That's why in the book I go through science, history, my personal story, but also the Bible. Because if you look at even how Jesus handled trauma, you remember Peter denied Jesus 3 times when a little girl peer pressured him, but there's a topographical trigger that the author puts in as a little detail. It says that he denied Jesus 3 times next to a charcoal fire. A few chapters later, Jesus is on the Sea of Tiberias on the beach, and it says that he was next to a charcoal fire. And that's where he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Peter said 3 times, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And what he was doing, psychiatrists would tell us, is the modern technique of psychodrama hundreds of years before it was even invented. He was walking Peter through his topographical triggers. The 3 denials, he has Peter tell him 3 times he loves him. The charcoal fire, he takes Peter back to a charcoal fire, is walking him through his trauma and retraining his brain, reframing his pain so that he could actually heal him. And the Bible is filled with stories of this wonderful counselor who offers a nepenthe, a panacea, a cure-all, who offers us hope in the face of depression.
You know, it's so interesting that one of the things that we've done in the body of teaching the Bible is we tend to tag people for what they were, not who they are. The example I use is Rahab. Every church I ever pass that has the message on Sunday, it always says next to Rahab, what's the next 2 words?
Prostitute,
the harlot. The harlot.
Yes.
Okay. Why doesn't it say Rahab the first Corrie ten Boom?
There you go.
Why doesn't it say Rahab? If you are looking for a husband on Facebook or on Match.com and you want your Boaz, then you better have a prerequisite that your mother-in-law needs to be a former prostitute.
Wow.
And you go, what? Yes, Rahab, the mother of Boaz. If Boaz was so wonderful, where did he learn his lessons? How did he become that man that would wind up becoming the father and be married to Ruth and to have this line that leads us to David, to Messiah? She played such a pivotal role in her transformation, but yet for 3,000 years, we have labeled her as Rahab the harlot, and we will not let her outlive her past label.
You're
and
right.
This is what we've done to people who've made mistakes, and what people have been trained to view themselves by their error, by what they did, by what they used to be. And this idea of Paul presented in 2 Corinthians 5:17 as this new creation. This conversation that Nicodemus has with Jesus about being born again. So remember, there was no New Testament at the time these conversations are going on. So there must be a Jewish construct for that, and it is. It's the breaking through the water of the mikveh, the cleansing pool. That's how Jesus came up out of the water. That's what baptism, when you come up out of the water, you're a new creation. When you break through your mother's water, your water breaks, and then what happens when your head first appears? They call that crowning. And so we get this crown at birth. They even call it that. The doctors say the baby's crowning. The head's coming forth. The new life is coming forth. We've labeled, and we become a labeling society. And you even call yourself an ex-suicide. Now, as I look at you, I don't want to look at you in the context of what you used to be. I don't even believe that that's a part of somebody's testimony. I believe your testimony begins the day you come to the Lord. And God wants us to give an account of what He's done for us since that time. Yes, I did drugs in the 70s. But I didn't come to the Lord until I was 44. I was 44 years in the synagogue.
Wow.
How do I want to be labeled? How do I want to be remembered? How do I want to tell my story? My story began in 1996. It didn't begin in 1952 when I was born.
You're right. You're right.
It began when I began as a new creation. And if we would embrace this miraculous transformation that God has planned for us, and that everybody who has ever walked this path before has comparable experiences, some more larger magnitude, some on a smaller magnitude. But if you've had it easy and life has been a bowl of cherries for you, you have to ask yourself, what have you been doing for the kingdom? Because you're obviously not on the front lines.
That's really interesting because, Winston Churchill said, if you have enemies, good, it means you stood up for something at some time in your life. If Jesus said, if you are persecuted for righteousness' sake, great is your reward in the kingdom of heaven. Paul said, whoever desires to live godly will suffer persecution. So I think that when the headwinds are coming against you, as Isaiah says, that causes you to ride on the heights of the land. Just like birds are using the headwinds to get to loftier planes of flight. But I want to point out what you said about Rahab. That's so good, about her being labeled as the harlot, the prostitute, when the Bible puts her in the hall of faith. When James uses her as an example of faith proven by works, I kind of look at Rahab as the matron of hope. And here's why. When she let down her cord, her scarlet thread, from the window, you can correct me if my pronunciation's wrong here, but the Hebrew word for cord is tiqwa, and it's the same word that's used of hope.
Yes.
And that's what hope is in the Hebrew language. It means knitted. It's used of a cord. It's not loosey-goosey. It's not fraying at the ends. You may be at your rope's end, but you're not at your hope's end. Tiqwa is knitted to the ultimate reality, God, the Godhead itself, the divine source. And that's why we have to continue to realize that, like Rahab, we have this hope that we can hold fast to that will save us. We're not only saved by grace through faith, Romans says we're saved in hope. But also what I think is really interesting is your mention of labels. In certain Polynesian tribes, they don't have a word for grief. So when someone they love dies, they say they experience fatigue. Because they don't have a label for grief, psychologists argue that they're not conscious of it. We're only conscious of that for which we have a label. That's why little kids are always asking these two words, what's that? With wide eyes, what's that? They're trying to label the world so that they can form their consciousness around that label. You look at the Greeks didn't have a word or label for blue, so they couldn't see blue. You read Homer, he calls it the wine dark sea. To them, the sea was purple or gray. They couldn't see blue because they didn't have a label for it. And that's why I love what Jesus did with labels. You remember that story of him encountering Legion. He said, "What is your name?" And the man replies, or the demon in the story replies to the man, "We are Legion." And it wasn't until the demon was named and labeled that it was dragged out of the shadows into the light and cast out of the man. And sometimes the thing we need to label is not ourselves. We need to label the anxiety. We need to label the demon. We need to label the shadow, confess that, drag it out into the light, and then the Lord can cast it out. And what's even cooler, and I think you're going to like this with your rabbinic history, but as you know, like the legions were Israel's greatest shame. They were Roman military militia units consisting of 6,000 troops that didn't acknowledge Jehovah primarily. They were just roaming through the streets of Israel, to remind everybody that the Jews were a defeated foe. So if you're hearing this story through first century Jewish ears, and Jesus casts legion out of the man, what's he doing? He's casting out Israel's shame. The legionnaires were some of Israel's greatest shame reminders, because their land is surrounded by legion. So Jesus casts out legion. What's he doing? He's casting out Israel's shame. So I'm with you there. We need to cast out shame in the labels too.
Ben, you're talking about the dominion mandate. Now, if you remember the story in Genesis, God brought everything to Adam to name, and everything that he gave a name to, he had dominion over. Okay? The only thing that God did not bring Adam to name was himself.
Wow.
Now, he even had dominion, named his wife Eve. Okay? Had dominion. When that dominion was usurped in the garden, we lost that dominion.
Yes.
As culture began to evolve, all right, and we get into that intertestamental period when the Greeks, the Seleucids, were taking over Israel and the land. The Greek mind, everything fits in a box. If it has a name, I can define it by a name. That's why we have diagnosis. If it has a name, I can treat you. But if it doesn't have a name, I have to I have to go through a process of ruling out till I find it. Then once I can diagnose, name, I can treat.
You're right.
In Luke 10:19, Jesus restored that dominion to us when he said, I give you the authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing whatsoever shall harm you. By us not naming depression, by us not naming anxiety, by us not naming, by pulling back and saying, I don't want that name, we forfeit our dominion over it.
That's right. That's good.
And we don't become a participant in our healing. We actually we have enmity between what we're struggling with and calling it by name.
Wow.
People call me for counsel and say, I've been diagnosed with cancer. And I say, tell me what kind. They say, anorthropic papilloma. I said, great. Spell that out for me, write that out for me, because now that it has a name, I can speak right to it. You see, the disciples brought a man to Jesus and they couldn't cast out the demon. Why? Because it was a deaf and dumb spirit. It could not tell them its name. Only God has Only God has dominion over that which has no name.
Wow.
We have dominion over anything with a name. God has given us that. Luke 10:19. It's very clear. Okay? He says in Luke 10:18, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, and I give you that authority now. I'm restoring what was usurped in the garden. Okay? It took 4,000 years. Okay? But yet, we got it back. Now we have it.
Wow.
Right? So as we look at this, and we look at the challenges of this, we don't want the stigma, but yet without the name, I have no dominion over it. I'm fighting an unseen enemy, that dark night of the soul. I'm having this battle, this struggle in the unseen, unknown, unnamed realm, and it's overwhelming. It's too big, because that which is hidden in the shadows is so much larger than that which is brought out into the light.
Wow.
When it's brought out into the light, and I can name it, I can begin my course of healing, because now I know who I'm contending with and what I'm contending with.
Wow. I have to say, this is one of the most interesting talks I've had about my book thus far. This is great stuff. I have never thought of that. The deaf and dumb spirit couldn't speak a name. Therefore, the disciples lost power over it. And in Jewish culture, when a man would name something, he was exercising ownership over it, which is why Adam named the animals. He was subduing the earth and having dominion over it. So in Revelation, if you fast forward from the beginning to the end, Jesus hands us a white stone with a new name that only the giver and the receiver knows, because he has authority over us. And that's why Jesus was baptized at 30, because in Jewish culture, man turns 30, he inherits everything his father has. He was coming into his father's inheritance. In my father's house are many mansions. That's why he never does a miracle until he turns 30. because then he empowers, enables, ennobles, and equips us to be heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. And he says, now come into my Father's house, which I've inherited. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. We become heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. We now have dominion over the earth to subdue it. But you're right, naming it has so much power. When my counselor diagnosed me with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, I didn't say, oh man, like that's a bummer. That now defines who I am and that gives me my ID and alters my ego. No, I say, okay, now I know what to contend against. Now I know how this thing can be treated. Now I know what I'm supposed to fight. And that was actually a massive leap forward in my healing process. So it's interesting because dolphins, they name themselves at birth. So dolphins, along with chimpanzees and elephants, are some of the smartest animals. And dolphins will name themselves at birth, and then the other dolphins will respond to that call that the dolphin utters to name itself. And I think that the Lord, he doesn't look at us according to the names that others put on us. Rather, he gives us the name that we always wanted with the white stone. But in order to exercise dominion with the authority of that name over the earth, we have to then name the legion, name the PTSD. And when we label the shadows and drag it out into the light, that's when we have the authority to cast it out.
In Hebrew, do you know what your name means?
Son of my right hand.
Son of Courson. Ben, son of Courson. What's your father's last name? Courson.
Courson. Yep.
You are named son of Courson, Ben Courson. Okay, son of Courson. So even in modern day naming conventions,
you're right.
All names are prophetically given. If you name your child Mara, which means bitter, you can pretty much expect them to live up to the name you gave them. When you look at Jacob's encounter with his sons, okay, and he went name by name, Reuben, you're this, and he prophesied over them. Right? We take a look at how those prophecies, the prophetic naming and the prophetic fulfillment, came to pass for each one of his sons, right, as he prophetically spoke over them. Okay? This is the way God works, and it's not a matter of name it and claim it or any of these other ideas. It's a matter of the dominion mandate that God gave us, that he has dominion over all that which has no name. This is why in the Jewish life, we don't ever endeavor to name God. We don't call him Yahweh or Jehovah. His name, as far as we know, is Ayeh Asher Ayeh. I am that I am. That's it. We don't try to pronounce the tetragram. We have references, Hashem, Elohim, Adonai, the Lord, but never is an attempt made in the Hebrew mind to ever try to name God. For if I name him, I can define him. If I can define him, I have dominion over him. That's a very Greek mindset, to have dominion over and have pursuit of naming. Okay? We accept it. We yield to the sovereignty of God and are very comfortable that he's given us dominion over what he's given us dominion over. We don't define God. God defines us.
Wow.
We're talking with Ben Courson, author of a new book entitled Flirting with Darkness, Building Hope in the Face of Depression. It chronicles his own struggle with depression, but it's not a story about depression. It's actually a chart to navigate the challenges that we all face, that major characters of the Bible, Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, the lamenter, the one whose heart was so connected with Israel that he cried before the Lord, and we memorialize that cry for Israel every year in the synagogue. God understands our heartache and our heartbreak. And you might ask the question, well, how could a loving God allow my sister, my brother, my father's first wife to pass away? How could my relationship of 8 years come to a shattering halt and leave me heartbroken and lost. What kind of God would do that? A God that has set you apart, who has a path for you, but it's with Him. It's not on your own. It's with Him, it's through Him. And then all the tools that He's given us in this age and in this time, so that when you're staring at the edge of the cliff, you know that there's a scarred hand reaching down from heaven, asking you to put your scared hand into His scarred hand.
Wow.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll return and continue in this discussion about flirting with darkness, building hope in the face of depression with Ben Courson. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and my special featured guests twice per month with Rabbi Zeb Parat and Carl Gallups, and monthly with Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Lake, Dr. Timothy Jennings, Dr. Mark Baker, Dr. Jeffrey Johnson, Drs. Michelle and Mark Sherwood, Dr. Kim Moss, Derek Gilbert, Peter Rosenberger, Brandon Gallups, Steve Fair, Stephen Black, and Sean Tabbitt for in-depth insights into Israel, prophecy, the unseen realm, the brain, spiritual warfare, overcoming shame, mysteries of the Bible, prophetic insights, the sensational and the supernatural, caregiving, addiction recovery, understanding the divided heart, same-sex attraction, and much more. We're proud to feature some of the greatest biblical minds from both Israel and around the United States. Check out our featured guest lineup and 24/7 feed on ignitinganation.com, or watch by topic on any device with our free apps. If you can't find what you need, you're just not looking in the right place. Follow us on social media and download our free apps today.
With today's smartphone technology, news, information, sports, and entertainment is widely available and almost unbounded. But what about the information that believers in Yeshua are looking for? Well, now there's an app for that. Igniting a Nation now has apps available for Android and iPhone. With our app, you'll gain access to everything you would in our website, from our featured guests to our live streaming shows. Visit Google Play or the Apple Store and download Igniting a Nation's new app today.
Shalom. I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, inviting you to join me and Israel's #1 rated guide, Edo Canaan, for our annual Israel trip. Our 2022 trip is now open for registration for our 18th trip to Israel. Our trip will take us from Tel Aviv to the Galilee, down to the Dead Sea, and 4 nights in Jerusalem. You will walk where Yeshua walked and watch the Bible turn from black and white to living color. Visit ignitinganation.com/events and download the registration form today. No, it's not too early to take advantage of our payment plan designed to fit any budget. All of our trips sell out, and we want you to experience this life-changing journey. Registration is now open for April 2nd to 13th, 2022, and we promise you, you will never read your Bible the same way again. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Ben Courson, author of the new book, Flirting with Darkness, Building Hope in the Face of Depression. Ben, welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm having such a great time and learning so much as well.
Well, you are a terrific guest, and we hope to get to know you better over time, because you're speaking to a generation. My daughter's 31.
Wow.
I've navigated many of these struggles with her. She's navigated many of these struggles with me, as she saw me live through a horrendous betrayal, and how it really devastated me to the point where I questioned my calling. But God was faithful to send a counselor who specialized in pastoral betrayals, and put me in the right place with the right person, and the counseling was phenomenal. And I guess reaccepted the mantle and returned to the pulpit in his church, my counselor's church, for 4 straight days, as he says, I want you to
Wow.
return. I want you to return to the pulpit in my church, so that you
Yeah.
know you've really come full circle in reconciling with this situation.
Whoa. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
So we have an audience out there that may not be aware, but here in the United States, September is Suicide Prevention Month. We spend a little bit more time talking about this tragic, devastating to all who are left behind, to deal with what they could have done, what they should have done. Maybe they should have said this or done this. And there's two sides to this equation of depression and anxiety and suicide. There's the one going through it, and then there's those that know them, that love them, that care for them, and don't know what to do for them, don't know what to say to them, don't know how to be present with them. And part of your story and part of your book is not only for somebody who's going through this, but for somebody who knows somebody who's going through this, so that they can get on board the right way. Right?
Yes.
Not tell them to suck it up and get over it, but have the right, really biblical and personal response. So what would you say to somebody who's struggling, who's considering what you considered, Googling, what's the most painless way to end my life? What's the most effective way? You found yourself in that place, making those searches, and what did you need to hear that was able to move you from that place in abject darkness into a place of abundant light?
Yeah, I needed to hear there was hope. I think a lot of times we surround ourselves with the wrong voices. People who tell us, hey, at least you have your legs, like at least you're not whatever. We're listening to these voices that really just tell us, suck it up, you need to think more positively. And I when I wasn't surrounding myself with the right voices, it was just despair convincing me that my future was swallowed by an infinite gray. And so in this book, I lay down 11 weapons to defeat the dark lord of depression, to arm people to the teeth. And there are 11 practical action steps and handles that people can employ and deploy to defeat this dark lord of depression. The first one I talk about, and I know we don't have time to go through all 11, but I'll just give a little sneak preview. The first one is prayer walks. Scientific research has shown us that when you talk to God about your hopes, fears, and dreams, it has the same effect on your brain as therapy, which is amazing because the Bible says he's the wonderful counselor. And the good thing is his therapy's free. When you talk to a loving God, magnetic resonance imaging, brain scans, and CAT scans show us that your frontal lobe activates into its highest intellectual capacity, and you actually boost your brain intelligence through prayer. You build richer, thicker gray matter in your prefrontal cortex, which is the center of creative thinking. You have more blood flow to your anterior cingulate cortex, which is the center for empathy and compassion in your brain. It's hard to put someone on your hit list who you put on your prayer list. You have less blood flow to your amygdala. They call it the rat brain. That's where fear, anger, stress, high blood pressure come from and originate from. And you actually, through neuroplasticity, can change the pathways and the synapses and the neurons, the pathways in your brain. You can build new grooves to cause your brain to run toward the light. And I think a lot of people assume, because there is a biological component to depression, then I am just stuck with this psychological equipment because I inherited it from mom and dad. But there's this passage in Ezekiel where Ezekiel rebukes the people of Israel because they said, our teeth are set on edge because our fathers ate sour grapes. And that was just a proverbial way of saying, we're the way we are and we're sinning because we inherited it from our fathers. And Ezekiel was saying, don't say that, because the fact of the matter is, although there is a biological component to depression, there's also something that I believe is even more powerful, and that's called neuroplasticity. Daniel Amen, he has done more brain scans than anyone in history, 83,000 brain scans over a 22-year career. And he found that the brain can change. That is the common denominator in all of his brain scans. The brain can change. And through rote and repetition, you can drive your thoughts toward the light if you practice it over and over and over again. I don't mean just thinking about, fluffy puppies. I mean like really driving your thoughts toward hope, toward the light. You can actually change your brain chemistry. And one of the ways to do that is through meditation and through prayer.
A relationship, close encounter with God is not a cliche. It's not a panacea. Anything that begins with pan is paying homage to a false god. So we know that that was a place that Jesus stood at the temple of Pan and declared
yes
that he had overcome the gates of hell, and that was right there at that place in Israel. Close encounters with God, with people that will speak life into you, with the wisdom of counseling, professional counseling. Asking for help is not unbiblical. It's not a sign of weakness. It's actually what God wants us to do. He actually gives us his phone number, Jeremiah 33:3. It says, call on me and I will answer you and I will show you marvelous things you've never seen before. Imagine getting a glimpse into the life God has in store for you as opposed to what you think in the natural. The heavenly mind is what God really wants us to set our mind on, things above, not things below. And you give us a roadmap to be able to do that. And it's more than just a glimmer of hope, it's actually a pathway. And Jesus said that I am the way, and we're instructed in Deuteronomy 6, verses 5 through 9, to walk along the way and to talk about God when we walk along the way, when we rise up and when we lie down. And so this is not Ben Courson's recipe. This is God's recipe, going all the way back to the original instruction, and then the revelation of Jesus declaring that he is that way. And he tells us that when he tells us what the greatest commandment is, because he begins that passage. We're supposed to finish the passage to understand the fullness of that greatest command: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. Ben, you are out there, you're hearing from people, you're engaging people. Today there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. There's a massive IV injection of fear with the COVID outbreak, what's going to happen to the economy, what's going on in your own state with riots in the street. Does the message change based on the circumstance?
I believe the message is timeless, therefore timely, and it's timeless truths for truthless times. In a postmodern relativistic age, the message is unchanging, but it's adaptable. And I think it's J.R.R. Tolkien, he didn't like allegory. So when C.S. Lewis dedicated Screw Tape Letters to him, he wasn't happy about it. But he didn't like allegory, but he liked applicability. And I think this message has applicability, that the ring doesn't, represent nuclear weapons, and Sauron is not Adolf Hitler, but you can apply it to that if that's your struggle. And I think that's what's so potent about the Bible. It's living, it's fluid, it's alive, it's not static, it's kinetic, it's moving, it can go, it can run right into what's happening in our culture and refresh us with living water today. And I'll tell you what, I mean, even where I live, I had my neighbor text me, like a friend who lives close by. Another thing, after these wildfires are breaking out, like where I live, it's just covered in billows of smoke. You feel like you're in the suburbs of Gehenna. 36 wildfires raging through Oregon. My friends are like, just one of my friends has to sleep on floors of other houses because his stuff got burned. You look at Kate Brown, our governor, who said that this is the worst loss of life and property that the state of Oregon has ever seen. And the COVID-19 outbreak, initially they were saying the 32.9% GDP, loss in that quarter. Initially, it's the worst that we've seen since like 1947 or whatever. The economy, all this stuff that we've been going through, the race problem, racism. Then there's riots in Portland. It seems like Portland's not even part of the US anymore. It's just a wild time. And so that's why I think it's more important than ever that we be hope dealers and that we be beacons of hope in these uncertain times. See, we live in an era where we are trying to, and even feel we have, to a certain extent, conquered mystery. Ever since we've discovered quantum mechanics and the microscope and the telescope, post-Enlightenment, we feel like, hey, we're conquering mystery. But then when COVID hits, when racism occurs, when riots and looting are happening in the streets, when wildfires are raging, when the economy is experiencing a downturn with, Dow Jones, initially when COVID happened, it was at its lowest since 1987. When we go through stuff like this, we don't know what the future holds. But the good news is that we know that our Lord is already in the tomorrows. Back in the ancient Near East, the Oriental shepherd would be a little ways ahead of his sheep. There's this obscure passage where it says Jesus walked a little way ahead of his disciples, close enough to relate, but far enough away to motivate. And the Oriental shepherd would go a little ways ahead of the sheep so that any predator that tried to get to the sheep had to go through the shepherd. So too, our good shepherd is a little ways ahead of us, meaning he's not just our rear guard, but he is the God who goes before. And because of that, he's in the tomorrows. And whatever mysterious future might lie in wait for us, any of the problems lying there have to go through him before they get to us.
That was the pattern there when they came to the Red Sea. It was the pillar of cloud in the front. They arrived, the pillar of cloud moved to the back. And so God's position changed Israel's perspective. And when we find God's position, our perspective will change.
You're right.
It's a message of hope in hopeless times. It's when everything in the natural looks like it's falling apart. God has changed his position so that we can change our perspective.
Yes.
We've been talking with Ben Courson, author of the new book, Flirting with Darkness, Building Hope in the Face of Depression. You can find out more about him at bencourson.com. Follow him on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And you can click on today's show at ignitingnation.com. It'll take you to a link right to his book. Ben Courson, it has been a delight to have you on the program. We just have run out of time, and I'd love to have you back anytime you want to come back. We've got lots to talk about, and would love to have you back on the program. So thank you for being with us.
Let's please do this again. I mean, this is one of those rare times where I'm doing Flirting with Darkness press, but this one I'm like listening and learning, and our conversation's really fun. And anytime I can talk to a rabbi, I'm in.
Well, you've got my number, you've got my email address. Let me hear from you, and I'll always be available for you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks. God bless you.